speaking of evangelism, the good news is, according to verse 19, you might not even need to evangelize. Perhaps nature itself is the ultimate evangelist. You know what I'm saying?
Ooh, I like
So I'm going to read verses 19 and 20 here. They know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky through everything God made, so they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God. All right, so I had to flag this verse, even though I feel like we have talked about this before, just the classic question of, well, what about people who've never heard the gospel, people who were born into a different religion, or just, we're just not exposed to the Bible or the gospel in any way. We've talked about this before, but I had to flag this verse because this is the verse people always go to whenever you start asking those kinds of questions. This idea of general revelation. And I'll say I understand the argument of, like, let's say you're just in a society, you've never heard of the Bible, you've never heard of Christianity, or maybe you've never heard of religion in any sense. I could see how you could just observe the natural world and say that, oh, there must be some kind of creator, like a God must have created this. It does seem to like not really align with other Christian values of, as I've said before, God seems to be very particular about, he wants you to worship the correct God and not worship like pagan gods. Even in later in this chapter, in verse 23, it talks about kind of the idolatry of the Roman people worshiping other gods and stuff like that. And I could see someone who is exposed to general revelation in this way, who's like, okay, there must be like a God of the sea and a God of the sky, or there must be just some general creator God. But you could get that from the natural world, but there's no way you would get specifically Yahweh, who sent his son Jesus, and all of the specific tenets of Christianity. And as Romans says here, God reveals himself with his invisible qualities, right? So that speaks to the understanding of the Christian God. He doesn't reveal himself physically. You have to kind of go on the feels a little bit. So my question is, how can God judge someone for coming up with the wrong picture of God, or even know God at all, if he's not going to reveal himself fully?
So I think that's a really good question. I think sometimes Christians can be a little unfair where, we say things like, well, it's so obvious. Just look at a sunset and God should make perfect sense, and I think that's a little arrogant to imply that someone should be able to just deduce all the wonders of God from creation. So I want to read a quote that I think levels the playing field a little bit. Is going to seem to argue against what I'm about to say, but I'm going to throw you a bone here. This is from Pete Enns. He's a biblical scholar. He is a Jesus follower, so it might be confusing as I get into this. He says this: our creation is a cosmic curveball that challenges the notions of God we are familiar with rather than confirming them. Okay, and it's great. This quote is about Romans 1. So he's saying, rather than just assume, of course, it all should make sense, you start studying things and it's not always clear. And some of the time you're like, wait, what does that mean about God? Then he says this: if we hope to echo Paul's words today, we need a creator God who outmatches the expansive, dynamic creation, a God who out-mysteries the mystery. I love this because what he's saying is, so often the view of Jesus we end up creating, the view of God, is so little. And then you look at creation, and creation seems so complicated, so fascinating. I've been reading about quantum physics lately. Have you done much study on quantum physics, Jeff?
No, not since we had a question on the podcast about what's the origin of the universe. But
it is, you want to get your literal head to hurt. I mean, like your brain starts hurting. And I'm just reading this, trying to understand, how on earth is this a science? It is like science fiction, but it's real, Mm-hmm. Oh, now, I think we got to make some room for the mystery, and I do think we need a bigger view of God than we often argue to make sense of how complicated creation is. There's a couple words that I want to set out here that I think are helpful that put some of these ideas into perspective. One is the word pantheism. Now, pantheism is the idea that God is all that exists in creation. In other words, God is everything. So you see this with some religions in the world, and truthfully, just how some people seem to think about God. So then you see a beautiful sunset. God is the sunset in pantheism. You see a beautiful mountain. God is the mountain in pantheism. Okay. I personally would say I don't think that's a Christian way of understanding creation. I think there's a better option. It's called panentheism, adds an en, which is the belief that God is separate from all that exists, but God is in, that's the extra en, he is in all things, and likewise that all things exist within God. So rather than saying God is the sunset, I would say God is in the sunset. So it is not the same as God. God is not literally the sunset. So I think this helps us get away from a lot of early historical religions where it's like, I'm worshiping the water and I'm worshiping the sun and I'm worshiping, because those are not God, but God is in those things. So I do think God reveals who God is using all of creation, but God is still separate than all those things. Now let's look at Paul's argument here. Paul's argument, as I understand it, is that everyone has some sense of God through creation. And I would say at that basic level, I have found that to be true. And I'm curious if you would agree. I think fundamentally, most people have some sense of God. And you said, don't perfectly understand like the Trinity or atonement. Like, yeah, for sure. But like some sense of God. So then if that is true, and if we could agree on that premise, it's essentially what are you doing with what you know? To whatever degree or sense of God you understand or you intuit, how are you responding to that? And I think you see this, the fact that, most cultures around the world would say that murder is a bad thing. Why? Like, well, you could go to a country that has a very different view of God, or a country that would say we're, an atheist country or whatever, and they would all have that sense of morality. There's a lot of overlapping sense of morality you find throughout history and throughout cultures that I would attribute to Romans 1, that there is some imprint in creation that we go, this doesn't feel right. Murder feels wrong. Murder seems bad. And I would say we get that from a sense of God, even if we call it a whole bunch of different things. Now, to your specific question, how can God say, why don't you have this figured out? If God's not going to reveal what's going on, I would say that creation isn't the best revelation of God. Jesus is the best revelation of God. So I would say creation does fall short at some point of fully teaching us all that God is, even though I think you can see God in creation. But Jesus is the full revelation. We've talked about this in our Hebrew series a lot. Jesus is the full revelation, the exact representation of God. So once you've seen Jesus, I think God can say, I have shown you what I'm like. I have given you a chance to see me. And, after Jesus, we can say, oh yeah, we've had a chance to see that and respond to that.